Bible prophecies being fulfilled today. The reading that we had tonight was taken from the book of Ezekiel. Ezekiel was one of the three major prophets in the times of the Old Testament, and the book of Ezekiel is one of the longest books in the Bible. It has 48 chapters, and they contain a range of prophecies. And some of these prophecies have already been fulfilled, and some of them, we believe, will be fulfilled in the future. And so when we come to understand a particular prophecy, one of the best ways to get started in understanding that prophecy is to first figure out whether it's speaking about the past or speaking about the future. So for Ezekiel 38, this is actually a relatively easy question to answer. This chapter tells us about a battle which is going to take place between two opposing confederacies of nations. And the last verse of this chapter tells us what the outcome of that battle is going to be. Verse 23 says, this is essentially God speaking, "Thus will I magnify myself and sanctify myself, and I will be known in the eyes of many nations, and they shall know that I am the Lord." And if you look at the nations of the world today, most of them have no conception of God, and many of them don't care about God whatsoever. And so it's fairly safe to say that that is not something that has yet been fulfilled. And so therefore this must be a prophecy about the future. And if you look at the rest of the book of Ezekiel, that works out as well. Because the next chapter, chapter 39, is really talking about the aftermath of this battle, what's going to happen after the confederacy is defeated. And then the rest of the book, chapters 40 to 48, is speaking about a temple, which we believe will be set up on the earth when Jesus Christ returns to the earth, and after he's interfered in this battle of chapter 38. So we mentioned before that this battle takes place between two main confederacies of nations. And so what we're going to do tonight is, well, this prophecy has not been fulfilled yet, we believe. But we're going to tonight look at how we can see God at work in the nations of the earth. Because if we look at the nations of the world, we can actually see them being moved into place and being moved into the positions which are required for this battle to come to pass. And so that's what we're going to look at. So we come to examine this chapter. There's really two main players, two opposing sides. And one side is detailed in verses 2 to 6. That's Gog and Magog and Meshech and Tubal and so on. And the other side is detailed in verse 13, Sheba and Dedan, the merchants of Tarshish with all the young lions thereof. And so they're the two main confederacies of nations. And then in verse 8, we're told where the battle is going to take place. And it says, "After many days thou shalt be visited. In the latter years thou shalt come into the land that is brought back from the sword, and is gathered out of many people against the mountains of Israel." And so that in verse 8 tells us where the battle is going to be. It's going to take place on the mountains of Israel. And so tonight we're going to look at all three of these main themes, and we're going to start with Israel. And it's going to start really with the history of the nation of Israel. So the nation of Israel started back in the book of Genesis. And it really started with a man named Abraham. But it didn't really start to become a nation until the time of Abraham's grandson, Jacob. And Jacob was a man who, he had a brother, and he fell out with his brother, and he had to flee from his brother into a far land. And so in Genesis chapter 29, we have a detail of the way he fled. He fled from the land, which is the land of Israel today. He fled to the land of Haran. And while he was in the land of Haran, he married two wives called Rachel and Leah. And now in Genesis 29:30, we have a detailed description of what happened in the early years of this family, because there was rivalry between the two wives, and between them, and between their two handmaids as well, they produced 12 sons. And so these 12 sons of Jacob eventually became the 12 tribes of Israel. And if you come over to Genesis chapter 32, we have the first mention of the word Israel. In Genesis chapter 32, verse 28, an angel one night appeared to Jacob. And Jacob wrestled with this angel, and after he'd finished wrestling, he asked the angel to bless him. And in Genesis 32, verse 28, this is the blessing that the angel gave him. And he said, "Thy name shall be called no more Jacob, but Israel, For as a prince hast thou power with God and with men, and hast prevailed. So the name Israel means a prince with power. And so that's what it's talking about in that verse. Jacob's name was changed from Jacob to Israel. And then out of Jacob and out of his 12 sons came the nation of Israel. Now later on in the book of Genesis, we have told to us how this family eventually journeyed down into Egypt. And they stayed in the land of Egypt for many years. And while they were there, they became a great nation. So much so that in the book of Exodus we're told that the Egyptians got worried about that and they made the Israelites into slaves. And after they had been slaves for a while, God sent a man named Moses down into Egypt to deliver them. And by the power of God, they were brought out of Egypt, brought through the wilderness, and brought into the land which is known as Israel today. And now in the book of Deuteronomy in chapter 28, we have told to us what happened just before they went into the land. Because while they were in the wilderness, God appeared to Moses, and God gave Moses a law. And this law was the law which was to be followed by the children of Israel. And God promised the children of Israel that if they were obedient to this law, that he would bless them. But if they were not obedient, then they would be cursed. So in Deuteronomy chapter 28, we have really an outline of this blessing and cursing. In Deuteronomy 28 verse 1, we're told, "And it shall come to pass, if thou shalt hearken diligently unto the voice of the Lord thy God, to observe and to do all his commandments which I command thee this day, that the Lord thy God will set thee on high above all nations of the earth. And all these blessings shall come on thee, and overtake thee, if thou shalt hearken unto the voice of the Lord thy God." And then he goes on to list and detail a whole series of blessings which will come on them if they were obedient. But then the other side of the equation, in verse 15, is this: "But it shall come to pass, if thou wilt not hearken unto the voice of the Lord thy God, to observe to do all his commandments and his statutes, which I command thee this day, that all these curses shall come upon thee and overtake thee." And then after that, we have a list of a series of curses which would come on them if they were disobedient. And so if we look at the history of the nation of Israel from that point onwards, we can see that happening. It's detailed throughout the Bible. And really what happened was, when they entered into the land, at first they were obedient and God blessed them. Then they turned away from God and they were cursed. And then they turned back to God and they were blessed again. This went on for many, many years. But eventually they became more and more disobedient and provoked God so much that God sent the armies of Babylon against them. And so Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came against Israel and took Israel into captivity. And they were in captivity for 70 years, and after 70 years, God once again allowed them to return. So they returned to the land of Israel, but once again, they obeyed God for a while, and then slowly they became disobedient again. And this culminated around the time of Jesus Christ, when they crucified Jesus Christ. And shortly afterwards, God sent the Roman army against them, and that the Roman army conquered the land of Israel and dispersed the Jews throughout all the nations of the world. And so really that has been the state of the nation of Israel for the last 2,000 years, since AD 70, really up to the start of the 20th century. The Jews had been dispersed throughout the nations of the world for around 2,000 years. The nations where they lived were largely hostile to them, and the country of Israel was part of the Turkish Empire. And so, thinking back to Ezekiel chapter 38, that prophecy requires Israel to be living, that requires the Jews to be living in the land of Israel for that prophecy to come to pass. And so, at the start of the 20th century, if you'd read Ezekiel chapter 38, perhaps you might have thought it was a bit far-fetched. It's not very likely to come to pass because, after all, there were no Jews in the land of Israel. Well, there were very few. But in fact, if we look at the history of the world for the last 120, 140 years, we can see that gradually God has brought the Jews out of the nations of the world, out of the nations that they were dispersed in, and back into the land of Israel. And so this started in 1881, which is what is known as the first Aliyah. And so the Jews are facing a lot of persecution in the countries of Europe. They had what's called pogroms, which were essentially riots against the Jews, where they went around killing them. And so perhaps it's not surprising the Jews fled. And when they fled, many of them settled in the land of Palestine. Then a couple of years later, in 1897, we had the first Zionist Congress, set up by a man named Theodor Herzl. And essentially the aim of that Congress was to form the Jewish state, form a state where the Jews could live together in their own country. And then a couple of years later again, from 1904 to 1914, we had what's known as the Second Aliyah. And during that decade, nearly 40,000 Jews fled from Europe. And once again, many of them settled in the land of Palestine. Then from 1914 to 1918, we had World War I. And during World War I, Britain and her allies actually conquered the land of Palestine, the land which we now know as Israel. And so it was no longer owned by the Turkish Empire. And you might think, well, that doesn't make much difference because, well, it used to be controlled by the Turkish Empire, and now it's controlled by the British Empire. What's the difference? Well, that in fact was quite significant because in 1917, the British government had produced the Balfour Declaration. And that was essentially a declaration that they supported, and they were going to actively try to establish a Jewish state in Palestine. And so now, afterwards, now that they've made that declaration, now they also control the land of Palestine, and they can do that. And so this is really what happened over the next 30 years or so. From 1913 to 1939, we had the third, the fourth, and the fifth Aliyahs. And during that time, over 150,000 Jews fled from Europe, and once again, they settled in Palestine. And much of that was due to the persecution of the Nazis leading up to World War II. Then finally, 8 years later, on November 29th, 1947, the United Nations voted in favour of the partition plan for Palestine. And a few months later, on May 14th, 1948, we had the Declaration of Independence, and the nation of Israel was reborn. And so you can see there that over the course of about 60 years, we went from having the Jews dispersed throughout all of Europe and really throughout the whole world. We went from that to having their own state under their own control back in the same land they were in 2,000 years ago. It's really quite remarkable, isn't it? And really that is exactly what we would expect based on Ezekiel 38. But if we look at Ezekiel 38, there's more details there which have also been fulfilled. Specifically, we would look at verse 8, which says, "After many days thou shalt be visited. In the latter years thou shalt come into the land that is brought back from the sword, and is gathered out of many people." Which is interesting, because that is exactly what has happened to Israel over the past 140 years. And it goes on to say, which have been always, against the mountains of Israel, which have been always waste, but it is brought forth out of the nations, and they shall dwell safely, all of them. And then again in verse 12, "To take a spoil and to take a prey, to turn thy hand upon the desolate places that are now inhabited, and upon the people that are gathered out of the nations, which have gotten cattle and goods that dwell in the midst of the land." And so you can see, can't you, that not only have Israel come back into their own land, but it is exactly as it was prophesied thousands of years ago by the prophet Ezekiel. And that's not all. There's more details in those verses, and we don't have time to go into all of them. But one I'd like to focus on is the idea of the cattle and goods. Where it says in verse 12 about they have gotten cattle and goods, that's really generic terms for riches, for wealth. And when we look at the nation of Israel today, that's exactly what they do have. In the year 2013, Israel ranked 10th in the world for the percentage of their population that were millionaires. It's said that their average standard of living is significantly higher than other countries in their region. And really, it's significantly higher than most other countries in the world. Just last year, in 2018, they ranked 7th in the world for growth in household wealth. Their average household wealth grew by 5,000. And finally, they have a booming technology industry. It's highly advanced. It's said to be one of the most advanced technology industries in the world, second only to the United States themselves. And so once again, that fits perfectly, doesn't it, with the details of this prophecy in Ezekiel. Now we're going to leave Israel now and look at some of the other players in Ezekiel 38. And the first one we want to look at is this first confederacy that's detailed in verses 2 to 6. So in verse 2 we're told, Son of man, set thy face against Gog, the land of Magog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal, and prophesy against him. And so in this verse we've got a whole list of nations listed. And Gog refers to an individual, and so he's the leader of the confederacy. But but in addition to that, we also have some other nations listed. We're told that Gog is of the land of Magog. We're told that he is the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal. And now where it says chief prince, well, the word chief is actually the Hebrew word Rosh, and it's a proper noun. So I should read the prince of Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal. And so we have these four nations listed there: Magog, Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal. And these names are actually ancient names which refer to ancient people groups. Magog refers to the Scythians, and that's a people who lives in Ukraine or the area of Eastern Europe in general. And then we have Rosh, and well, the historian Bocard tells us that Rosh, or Ross, is the most ancient form under which history makes mention of the name of Russia. Then we have Meshech, and that's referring to an ancient people known as the Muscovites. And, well, that's a word which we now know as Moscow because they settled in the area of Russia. And then there's Tubal, which is another people group who settled in the area of Russia. And now the word Tubal is actually a name which is applied to a river in Russia, the river Tubal. And so I think it's pretty clear to see that this confederacy, these four nations in verse 2, are speaking about Russia, the area around Russia. But there's a couple of other nations listed in addition, and they're in verses 5 and 6. There's also going to be Persia, Ethiopia, and Libya with them, all of them with shield and helmet, Gomer and all his bands, the house of Togarmah of the north quarters and all his bands, and many people with thee. So these nations as well are largely ancient people groups, which we can trace down to today. Persia refers to an ancient kingdom, which is the area that's now occupied by the countries of Iran, Syria, and Pakistan. We have Ethiopia, which is slightly different to modern Ethiopia. It's the area of modern Sudan. There's Libya, which we now know as Libya. There's Gomer, which refers to the Gauls, and that's the area which we now know as France and Belgium. And finally, there's Togarmah, which refers to the area around Georgia. So if we expect this prophecy in Ezekiel 38 to be fulfilled in the near future, based on this list of nations and based on the fact that these are all going to be confederate with one another, what would we expect to see happening in the world if this prophecy is to come to pass? Well, firstly, we would expect that these nations will be growing in military power, especially Russia, since they're going to be the head of the confederacy. We would expect to see Russia growing more and more aggressive. We would expect to see that the relationships between these nations would be growing stronger. We would expect to see Russia starting to exert their influence over these nations. And finally, we would expect to see Russia starting to get involved in the Middle East. And in fact, if you've been following lately the events in the world today, you might know that this is pretty much exactly what has been happening. And we don't have time to go into all the current events which suggest that this confederacy is starting to come together. We're just going to pick a few key ones which have happened recently. Particularly, we'd like to talk about Syria, because that was in the news quite a bit last year. What happened in Syria last year was there was a conflict between Syria and Turkey, where Turkey essentially invaded Syria. They would be protected by their ally, the United States, until Donald Trump decided that they were going to withdraw their troops. And suddenly, Syria had no ally left. And so who stepped in to fill the gap? It was none other than Russia. Russia stepped in to mediate between the two countries, and now Russia has control in Syria. So much so that a writer from last year wrote that Putin is the new king of Syria. And he made this comment: Vladimir Putin is now the strategic arbiter in Syria. Now, that's interesting, isn't it? Because that is exactly what we would expect based on Ezekiel 38. We would expect Russia and Syria to move closer together. We would expect Russia to have influence and control in Syria. Apart from that, if you look at the other international relationships that Russia has, they have growing relationships with Sudan, they have growing, strengthening relationships with Pakistan, two other members of the coalition. And in fact, all of those members are starting to get more and more friendly with Russia. Well, that's all right for the Middle East. What about Europe? Do we see Russia starting to become more influential in Europe? Well, the answer to that is yes, we do. And we don't have time to go into all the different ways in which Russia might exert their influence over Europe and all the different ways in which Russia can influence the events in Europe. We just have to pick one. One which came up recently was the supply of gas. Because you see, most of the gas in Europe, which is essential for their heating, essential for their survival in winter, most of that is supplied by Russia. And in fact, just a few days ago, on the 9th of January this year, a new gas pipeline from Russia to Europe was turned on, which increases Europe's dependence on Russia. The critics of these pipelines say that they will entrench EU energy dependence on Russia and enable the Kremlin to cut off energy supplies to Western allies, such as Poland or Ukraine, for political motives in the future. The US last month imposed sanctions on both Turk Stream and Nord Stream 2, which those are the names of the pipelines. So they imposed sanctions on these pipelines in the name of deterring Russian aggression in Europe. But these sanctions were too late to stop the Turkey initiative. They did interrupt construction of the last segment of Nord Stream 2 by forcing a Swiss pipelaying vessel to abandon work. But Russia has said it might use its own ship to complete the job, albeit with some delay. And so if we look at these events, we can see, can't we, that Russia is growing more and more influential in the nations of the world. And Russia is starting to exert their influence over Europe and over the Middle East, which is exactly what we would expect to see based on Ezekiel 38. So now what we're going to do is leave that confederacy and come to the other end of the chapter, to the opposition. So in verse 13 of Ezekiel 38, we have detailed the nations who oppose. Sheba and Dedan and the merchants of Tarshish, with all the young lions thereof, shall say unto thee, Art thou come to take a spoil? Hast thou gathered thy company to take a prey, to carry away silver and gold, to take away cattle and goods, to take a great spoil? And so these nations detailed here are in opposition to Russia's moves. They aren't too happy with Russia coming in and spoiling the land of Israel. So who are these nations? Well, once again, these are largely ancient names, which we can trace to their modern equivalents. Sheba and Dedan refers to the Arabian Peninsula, especially the nation of Saudi Arabia. Then we have the merchants of Tarshish. Well, Tarshish refers to Britain. And finally, we have the young lions. And it says there that there will be the merchants of Tarshish with all the young lions thereof. And so if these are the young lions of Britain, we would expect them to be the offshoots of Britain. In other words, the nations of the Commonwealth, broadly speaking. And so Sheba and Dedan, the Arabian Peninsula, merchants of Tarshish is Britain, young lions is the Commonwealth. And in fact, that idea has been picked up before for a World War I recruitment poster, which you can see on the screen, where Britain is represented as the old lion, which is a common symbol for Britain, and the allies of Britain, the young lions, are the Commonwealth. And so once again, we have to ask the question, well, is this being fulfilled? What would we expect to see happening in the world if this was fulfilled? And once again, we don't have time to go into all the details of all the world events which show this is coming to pass. For instance, there's the relationships between Saudi Arabia and Britain have always been strong, but just recently, Saudi Arabia has become much more friendly to the nation of Israel, which historically is not something that was the case. But what we're going to look at now is the relationship of Britain to the rest of Europe. Because if you think about what's happening in Ezekiel 38, we have the main Russian confederacy at the start of the chapter includes much of Europe. And on the other hand, we have the confederacy with Tarshish, which is Britain. And so if these two groups of nations are to fight against each other, Britain can't be in a legal relationship with the rest of Europe, can they? And so if we would expect this prophecy to come to pass, we would expect the relationship of Britain with Europe to weaken. We would expect Britain to move away from close integration with Europe. And that, in fact, is exactly what we've seen happen over the past few years. So Britain has been part of the European Union since the year 1975. But a few years ago, on the 23rd of June 2016, Britain held a referendum on whether they should continue to be part of the European Union. And 51% of the population voted to leave the EU. And that vote triggered the Brexit process, which has been going for the past 3 years. A few days ago, the UK Parliament finally passed a vote in favour of Prime Minister Boris Johnson's Brexit deal. And it now seems quite certain that Britain will leave the European Union at the end of this month. And what's more, the UK has already been making plans for future trade deals with the Commonwealth and with the United States. And once again, based on Ezekiel 38, that is exactly what we would expect to happen. And so I think we can see from this chapter that the prophecy, though this prophecy has not yet come to pass, we can see that the nations of the world are gradually being moved into place, moved into the positions that they need to be in for this prophecy, for this battle to happen. And so, well, we might think, well, so what? I mean, that's good for Britain, that's good for Russia, and we hope they enjoy their little dust-up in the Middle East. But what does it mean for us? Well, we've already mentioned the fact that the end of the chapter tells us what the final outcome of the battle is going to be. In verse 23, it's talking about the destruction of the Russian Confederacy. And it says, "Thus will I magnify myself and sanctify myself, and I will be known in the eyes of many nations, and they shall know that I am the Lord." And so you see that this battle isn't actually going to be left to chance. It's not going to be left to chance as to whether Russia wins it or whether the opposition wins it. God himself, through Jesus Christ, is going to interfere in this battle. And God is going to destroy the Russian Confederacy. And subsequent to that, Jesus Christ is going to set up the kingdom of God on earth. If you come to Zechariah chapter 14, we have further details given to us on this same battle. And Zechariah 14 is a prophecy which essentially deals with the same events in a slightly. So Zechariah chapter 14 verse 2, we're told, "For I will gather all nations against Jerusalem to battle," which once again is what Ezekiel 38 was saying. It says, "The city shall be taken, and the houses rifled, and the women ravished, and half of the city shall go forth into captivity, and the residue of the people shall not be cut off from the city." So what you see is that when Russia invades, at first they are going to see some degree of success with their invasion. But what happens next? Verse 3, "Then shall the Lord go forth and fight against those nations, as when he fought in the day of battle. And his feet shall stand in that day upon the Mount of Olives, which is before Jerusalem on the east. And the Mount of Olives shall cleave in the midst thereof toward the east and toward the west. And there shall be a very great valley. And half of the mountain shall remove toward the north, and half of it toward the south." And so you can see there that God himself is going to intervene in this battle. And in fact, if you come to Acts chapter 1, we can deduce some further details from this. Because in Acts chapter 1, we have the record of when Jesus Christ ascended into heaven. Verse 10 to 11, we're told, "And while they looked steadfastly toward heaven as he went up, behold, 2 men stood by them in white apparel, which also said, Ye men of Galilee, why stand ye gazing up into heaven? This same Jesus, which is taken up from you into heaven, shall so come in like manner as ye have seen him go into heaven." So what happened in Acts chapter 1 is that Jesus Christ ascended up from the Mount of Olives. And we believe that he is going to descend onto the Mount of Olives in a similar fashion. But it's not just going to be Jesus Christ who comes to interfere in this battle. If you come back to Zechariah chapter 14, we have some further details in verse 5. And ye shall flee from the valley of the mountains, for the valley of the mountains shall reach unto Azul. Yea, ye shall flee, like as ye fled from before the earthquake in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah. That subsequent to that, and the Lord my God shall come, and all the saints with thee. And so we have there another detail added for us. It's not just going to be God, it's not just going to be Christ with the power of God who intervenes in this battle. He's going to have the saints with him. And we believe, based on our interpretation of other passages of the Bible, that this army of saints is going to be made up of the faithful men and women who have served God in their lives. Because the Bible tells us that when Jesus Christ returns to the earth, he is going to set up the kingdom of God and rule over the whole world. And we believe that those who have faithfully served God in their lives will be made immortal and will rule with Christ. And we have that shown to us in the last book of the Bible, in Revelation chapter 11. In Revelation 11, verse 15 to 18, we're told, And the seventh angel sounded, and there were great voices in heaven saying, The kingdoms of this world are become the kingdoms of our Lord and of his Christ, and he shall reign for ever and ever. And the 24 elders which sat before God on their seats fell upon their faces and worshipped God, saying, We give thee thanks, O Lord God Almighty, which art and wast and art to come, because thou hast taken to thee thy great power and hast reigned. And the nations were angry, and thy wrath is come, and the time of the dead that they should be judged, and that thou shouldest give reward unto thy servants the prophets, and to the saints, and them that fear thy name, small and great. And so what we have there is an outline of the ultimate purpose of God in intervening in this battle in Ezekiel 38. Jesus Christ is going to set up the kingdom of God on the earth. And those who have served God in their lives, the saints, as we're told in Revelation chapter 11, that God will give his reward unto his servants the prophets, to them that fear his name, small and great. And so I think we can see from that, can't we, that this prophecy that we looked at in Ezekiel 38 has a personal meaning for you and for me. Because if we can see that God is working in the earth, and if we believe the purpose of God, then God has provided a hope for us for the future. And God has detailed in the Bible how we can become part of that hope, and how we can have a hope of in the future reigning with Jesus Christ over the earth and having immortal life. We thank you.